I'm Karen MacNeil, and this is winespeed.com's People to Know, insider interviews with the most important and fascinating people in the wine business. And today it's our great pleasure to be interviewing Dennis Groth, who with his wife Judy founded Groth Vineyards in 1981 in the Oakville Appellation in the heart of the Napa Valley. Just 4 years later, interestingly enough, the 1985 Groth Reserve Cabernet was the first wine in California to be given 100 points by the wine critic Robert Parker. Dennis began his career as the CFO, Chief Financial Officer with Atari. Well, actually, he didn't begin that way, but he certainly was doing that sort of work right before founding Groth Vineyards. And he was also very involved in the California wine industry, both in a large way and a small way. He was the first president of the Oakville Winegrowers Association, the president of the Napa Valley Vintners Association, and the chairman of the California Wine Institute at different points in his career. So, Dennis, welcome. Thank you for being on People to Know with us.
Well, it's nice to be here, Karen, and thank you for calling me fascinating and interesting.
Now, Dennis, you spent much of your career as an accountant. How did you first get introduced to the wine industry?
As a consumer, obviously.
Ah.
We grew up in California, and we discovered California wine, and we visited wine country, and we loved it as native Californians. We actually, to be honest, started drinking wine before we were 21.
You know what? And no one else did. You were the only person to do that. You very bad person. Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. So Dennis, back in 1981, when you purchased Groth, what became Groth Vineyards, what was Oakville like?
Well, actually, Oakville then looks very much like Oakville now. All the parcels, including ours, are about the same size they were when we purchased it. It was all agriculture. When we looked down on the center of the Oakville territory as we were coming into the valley over the Trinity grade or the Oakville grade, and we looked down and we saw a large patchwork of vineyards with very little development. I mean, you had the Oakville grocery on the corner, you had the post office there, you had a couple of wineries, and mostly vineyards, and we thought it was gorgeous. And our parcel, which we purchased in 1981, 121 acres, and it still is today. All the parcels next to me are virtually the same size, and that's because of our agricultural preserve here in Napa Valley, which doesn't allow parcels to be reduced in size and remain at agricultural size. So I think that's been a key to preserving the look of Napa Valley. Of course, it looks a little different now because we have far more restaurants, many of which are closed. We have a lot of choices for dining that didn't exist then. So it's become a little more sophisticated. There's more money in the valley, bigger wineries, more of them, etc.
Yes, but you're right to point out that the agricultural preserve really has lived up to its name. It has preserved the Napa Valley. Now, when you founded Groth, of course, you had been the CFO of Atari. Thank you for Pac-Man and all of those things. But how did you figure out how to run a winery? I mean, it's a very different business.
Well, let's see, I was 39. Judy and I were 39 at that time. We were planning in the early stages, probably in the 80s, because we began to identify land and we purchased this parcel in early 81. And, I did some research on the wine business. There was a famous report done by the Bank of America, because they were one of the biggest lenders to the wine industry, which said that for 30 years, the wine industry had enjoyed an average annual growth rate of 5% of sales for 30 continuous years. So the Bank of America was predicting prosperity. We loved wine. We loved wine country. And my pockets were bulging with ill-gotten gains from Atari video games that were purchased in the millions. We should invest. So we bought land and began to explore the whole concept of the wine business. Obviously, I knew nothing about the business itself. So we looked for land, we talked to people, we found people that we had known through other connections that were in the business, and got some advisors and just started doing it because we were young and dumb.
Well, thank goodness, right? Because that's how so many great entrepreneurial businesses begin. When you were the first president, of course, of the Oakville Winegrowers Association, and back in 1993, I think it was. And then was it hard to get people to work together? I mean, Oakville was already full of some very big personalities at that point. I mean, Robert Mondavi, for example. I mean, but not just Robert Mondavi. Was it hard to get people to kind of pull together and work together?
Well, it was. It actually started before Oakville when the Mondavi organization, and I guess Tim Mondavi was the primary advocate for it. They began to advocate for a system of appellations within Napa Valley. Napa Valley had been formed, I forget, 10 or 15 years prior. It was one of the first appellations in under the AVA, which is called the American Viticultural Area Organization, which is approved by BATF back then and ATT now. But Tim envisioned that Napa Valley, and he made a big presentation to the Napa Valley Vintners Association. Napa Valley should begin to recognize, he called them, they were like zip codes. They were like sub areas of Napa Valley. And he envisioned it being Napa in the south, Yountville, as you go up valley, Oakville, Rutherford, St. Helena, Calistoga, and then he had the mountainsides. There was a Vaca Range, which nobody was particularly attracted to, but the Mayacamas area had acquired some reputation. So he talked about dividing the valley that way, and that was met with great skepticism. I remember Joe Heights stood up in the Vintners room and said, Napa Valley's been good enough for me as long as I've been here, and I'm not interested in any subdivisions. So not everybody adopted it, but it did gain momentum and eventually became a blueprint that we adhered to. Oakville was one of my first personal experiences with that whole process of appellations, because the Mondavi organization had identified as one of their key holdings Oakville, which was their home winery. And they had applied for the formation of the sub-appellations of Oakville and Rutherford. And the question of how do we all get together and how do we form it, where do you define the boundaries, that is partly technical, because you have to go through a procedure of proving weather, soil conditions, historical use of the name, etc. But it's also very political, because people want to be in and people want to be out. And we saw that as the formation. But we did work together. I remember when I went to meet with Robert Mondavi one time about this whole concept. And I said, well, you know, Napa Valley's Napa Valley. I've been influenced by Joe Heights. And I said, what's the difference? And Robert looked at me and he said, what's the difference? You gotta be kidding. If you make Cabernet from Calistoga, it doesn't taste anything like Cabernet made down in Carneros. If you make Cabernet from Oakville, it doesn't taste like St. Helena. Don't tell me there's no differences. There's been differences and I know it.
There you
I
go.
said, yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah. Now, for you specifically, you went from a very fast-paced industry, I mean, the computer games industry, very fast-paced, to the slower cycles of the wine business. Was that difficult? Was that a challenge?
Yeah, it led to my first mistake in the wine business. I was
Which
impatient.
was?
I was impatient when I started the wine business. My first business plan said we'll make 10,000 cases of wine in vintage 1, 1982. We'll make 20,000 cases of wine in vintage 2, which was 1983, and we'll make 30,000 cases of wine in our third vintage, and then we'll level off and we'll become profitable and everything will be wonderful. And I consulted with one of my neighbors, Justin Meyer, who said, well, Dennis, that's a pretty aggressive plan. And my reaction was, you got to be kidding. That's a small business. I didn't even know how you make a living at 30,000 cases. So I was in a hurry. And what I didn't realize is you introduce a new brand into the market. Our first vintage of Cabernet Sauvignon was 1982, and we made 7,000 cases of it. It took us a year and a half to sell the first vintage when we released it. Our second vintage, of course, had already been made by then, and it was 10,000 cases. That was 1983. And when we released that vintage, after we sold the first vintage of 82, it took us 2 years to sell that vintage. And then by that time, we had cash stress, and we had to cut our inventory back and reduce some of the quantities we had made in 85. And we released the 1984 vintage, which sold out in 2 weeks. And people said, why can't you plan your business better? So, you know, we were cash strapped and pressed to the wall. And that was my first mistake.
Do you remember how much that first 1982 Groth cost? I mean, if you had bought it in San Francisco or New York, what was the retail price of that wine?
Recommended retail was $12.50, which
Whoa.
Justin told me was, yeah, he said, that's an aggressive price, Dennis. I don't know if you can get that. He said, I've been working at Silver Oak here for 10 years to get my price up to $12.50, and I'm stepping up there with that when I get to that vintage. He says, but that'll be a couple of years after you, and that might be hard. He was right. It was hard.
But lots of things must have changed with the 1985 vintage when your reserve was given 100 points by Robert Parker, who was very, very influential and important at that time, right at his ascendancy. So what was that like? How did you even find out?
I don't remember exactly when I found out. We had worked with, there was a marketing company called Wilson Daniels that we started working with. I realized that I didn't know how to sell wine into the marketplace, and our first winemaker, Nils Wenge, was a winemaker, not a salesman. So we needed professional help, and that was a professional wine marketing company, which took us on, and they had some other brands that they sold, including Roman Conti, which was their leading brand from Europe. But they had introduced us to distributors and started to get the wine out there into the network. But going back to your question, it was on, I know, the Parker. Well, you know, when you first introduce a brand, particularly with the first adopters are retailers. And if you introduce a brand, they're willing to taste it. And back then, retailers were wine merchants, and they regarded the customer as their customer, and they wanted to personally understand your wine. So you had to actually go out and talk to these people. You had to get salespeople that would get into their shops and show them the wine. And they would taste wine, and if they liked it, they might buy a case or two and carry it. Restaurants were more difficult because even if they liked it, their attitude tended to be, well, come back after 3 or 4 vintages and you have a track record, and I might put it on my wine list. It was an interesting world, but when Parker hit us with, that became the beginning of it. He acquired his fame with the 1982 Bordeaux, which were being released probably in 1985. And then he began to focus on California, and he identified our wine and started to follow up people. And that just made a stunning difference. In fact, before the 1985 vintage, the reason we sold out the 84 in 2 weeks is because Parker had tasted the wine and said, this 1984 Oakville Cabernet made by Groth Vineyards Winery has a pencil lead taste and aromas reminiscent of Chateau Latour, and it only costs $12.50.
Wow.
And that wine was, it adjusted the quantities down to only 6,000 cases of that wine because we couldn't sell, we had fallen behind and the bank was reining us in. And it was 4,000 cases. Those 4,000 cases were sold in 2 weeks because Parker wrote that review and gave it a score of, I don't remember, 94, 95, something like that. And so we began to take notice of Parker because he could really affect your sales.
Yeah.
And Wilson Daniel had introduced our wines to Parker. That's where we actually got the first introduction. The 85, we didn't even hear about that till we'd already sold it all to distribution. So by the time the review hit, and I think that sold at $25 a bottle, and it was gone, and everybody was calling and saying, don't you have any more? And I said, no, we're gone. It's done. Couldn't do anything about it.
No.
Couldn't even raise the price.
No, you couldn't. Wow, what a story. Now, Dennis, you're so well thought of as a business person. I'm just curious, when you, in those early years, did you feel that you had a very good wine tasting palate to begin with, or did you have to do something to sort of develop your palate? I mean, you referenced that you and Judy had already been wine lovers, and you loved good wine. But I'm curious, when after you started Groth, if you did something to help your palate get even better.
Well, yeah, we did. There was a group that it was called the San Francisco. It was from San Francisco. They called it the Vintners Association or something. I can't remember the name of it.
I think it was called the Vintners Club.
The Vintners Club. You're right.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And they love to get winemakers to attend their monthly meetings. And this was a group of San Francisco wine elites. They love fine wine, and they love Bordeaux, and they love Cabernets, and they love wines from everywhere in the world. And they love to get vintners to be members of it, because then they could put one of their wine. They did a blind tasting of 12 wines, and they would love to put your wine in the tasting and then taste it blind and ask you to pick out your wine. And we used to attend those meetings. Nils Bengi would come down with me sometimes, and he was the winemaker, so they could pin him down even further. It's your own wine, Nils. Can't you recognize it? But it was tastings. That's the real nature of the game. And over the years, I don't consider myself to have a great palate. In fact, Judy tells me, my wife tells me, that her palate is far superior. And
well,
it is.
Well said, just like a good husband. Well, our complete interview with Dennis Groth is at winespeed.com's People to Know page. Please check it out. You'll really like it. And Dennis, thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you.
My